Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome, everybody. So there's a few people joining us. We have a few of you already here, so big welcome. My name's Esther Whitehead, ko Esther Whitehead Tokuingwa, and I'm an associate with the Centre for Social Impact. And today we are on session 2, or part 2, of the Getting Shit Done for Climate Impact. Now, just ensuring with Michelle that everyone can hear us and everything's all good, Michelle?
Yes, looking good. I think I've got someone I need to mute, so just 1 second. I can hear a little
okay. So if everyone can just mute their mics, that would be amazing. It is an interactive session, but we're going to get you to engage through the chat. So we'll start off with Michelle doing your little survey that you do. Is that right?
Yeah, sounds great, everybody. So I just wanted to say a warm welcome to our session today. These Pūaha talks are brought to you by the Centre for Social Impact with support from Foundation North, and they're free to our community sector, which we love. I'm just going to ask you to take part in a quick poll, if you don't mind. Here it is, coming to your screen now. Foundation North is just interested to see how many of their grantees are coming along and taking advantage. So just to let you know as well, we have to date presented a wide range of topics, including grant writing, collaboration, evaluation and wellbeing. I'll pop a little link in the chat if you ever want to come back and check those out at another date. And it looks like everyone's voted. Thank you so much. Wonderful. I'll hand back to you, Esther, for our karakia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So firstly, I just wanted to state that last week we did session 1 on which was very much an inside-out approach, and this week is session 2, which is called the Perfect is the Enemy of Good. So a little bit of an explanation from me. Inside-out approach last week was very much about looking at our individual agency to make a difference. It looks at our ability, our anxieties and our aspirations and our own goals as to how we can affect change in climate impact through our mahi in our workplace. Today we're continuing that theme, but we're going to take it to a bit more of a corporate level. Now, just a quick opportunity in the chat for you to say where you're from today. So can you just in the chat, just type in which area you're from and perhaps also the workplace if that's relevant. Now, I can't see any of you and I can't see the chat, so I have to rely on Michelle to just give me a little bit of feedback. So what's coming through, Michelle?
1 second. Nothing
Sorry.
So far. Oh, here we go. Someone Tamaki, Habitat for Humanity. Thanks for being here. Yep, Tamaki Makoto.
Great. I think we've got people from all over the Motu, Queenstown as well. Awesome. So I am in Tahuna, Queenstown, so I'm presenting this from the Deep South. And we do have people from all over. So it's a great opportunity to connect with our community groups. This actual session is not going to be perfect for everybody, but I'm hoping that each of you will find some gems. Please do look at the recording from last week as well, and Michelle will send out comms following. So we're going to start with a quick question around what is perfectionism. Now, I know that this is a big topic and it means different things to different people, but if you have any insights, please can you just put in the chat what you think perfectionism is. So take a go at it. Could be lengthy, could be a couple of lines, could be one word. I'll explain perhaps what my view of it is in relation to what we're referring to today. Is there anything coming through on the chat, Michelle?
Yep, so we've got spending too long and more effort, not doing it until you're getting it right, or meeting expectations, must do everything really well. Yeah.
Okay, great responses, thank you. So you don't have to admit to whether you're a perfectionist or not. I think many of us suffer from perfectionism. We've seen a huge rise in the evidence in the last 30 years, regardless of gender or culture, in terms of perfectionism. And that's both academically in our schools, that's professionally in our workplaces, and it's also highly pervasive in social media. So it's no surprise to us that perfectionism is a problem in our workplace, and it is the enemy of action, and it is the enemy of good and good enough. So whatever it looks like, getting started is the only way that we'll finish. So we often see this kind of perfectionism and procrastination loop. And last week I spoke a lot about the journey and the complexity that we're on. And I had a wee graphic that looked a bit like a roller coaster ride, and that journey that we're each on in terms of uncertainties that we face in our futures. So this oversimplified graphic on the right says finished is better than perfect, and that's really what we're aiming for. So today I'm going to take us through a journey where I look at ourselves and an inside-out approach, and then I look at a community case study, a really brief one, and I look at a workplace case study. So let's identify the perfectionist which might be slowing down action. And we're going to think about this in terms of climate action. So Einstein had this quote: if I had 1 hour to solve a problem and my life depended on the solution, I would spend the first 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask. For once I know the proper question, I could solve the problem in less than 5 minutes. It might take us mere mortals a bit longer than 5 minutes. We're no Einsteins, maybe you are. But the purpose of this quotation is really, what problem are you trying to solve? Now, that might sound like a really simple thing to say, but in the climate space, we tend to pull out silo thinking from the system that we're working within and the complexity that we're working in, and we tend to look at a problem and a linear solution. So the goal then, if we are looking at what problem we're trying to solve, is to try, if we're perfectionists, let's seek perfection only in identifying the problem. Let's not seek perfection in finding the solution. Now, that sounds perhaps a little bit surprising, given that most of our schooling is associated with problem, solution, very linear. So, for example, systems failure is a significant cause of environmental degradation. So systems failure, the system that we work within, so a westernized capitalist society and the greater systems, the political systems, the economic systems that make up that, is a huge cause of environmental degradation. So systems change is a big part of that solution. And I mention that because we so often jump to other solutions that may not be anything to do with our systems at all, and therefore we don't necessarily identify the right problem. So if we think about climate impact, I want you to just type in the chat what sector you work in, whether it's housing, whether it's health, whether it's environment, biodiversity, whatever it might be. Just pop it in the chat for a moment.
Education, housing, community development, child youth development.
Okay, great. So climate impact and climate action now looks across all sectors. So whatever sector you work in, this is now part of your mahi. But none of us, or many of us, haven't been taught or don't know how to deal with this. What's really interesting is that a year's work on some problems can obviously help a lot more than a year's work on other problems, right? So there's a website called 80,000hours.org, and they did an analysis which suggested that the problem area you choose to work on may be the single biggest determinant of the climate impact that you have within your career or within your organization. So it's called 80,000 hours because it's an American website, and 80,000 hours was always the length of time that was seen for your career and the amount of work that you put into your career. So that is 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, because they only have 2 weeks holiday, 40 years. and that's 80,000 hours. So look, it's going to look somewhat different, but the bottom line here is that what we're dealing with is significant mahi that's being put into different areas, and we want to choose the area that's going to have the best impact. So from their research, what they really spent time researching and working on was that the most pressing problems are likely to have a good combination of the following qualities. They're going to be big in scale, they're going to be neglected, and they are solvable. So we know that climate is big in scale. We don't know which aspects necessarily of it are neglected, and we don't necessarily know which aspects are solvable. So there's a few things at play here, but to find the problem that you should work on is going to be obviously partially your consideration, but it may also just be the strategic vision of your organization. And you might not be able to do much work around that because it might be just the remit of your workplace. But I want you today, because this is an inside-out approach, to consider a personal fit. So could you become motivated to work on the problem that you identify? Or if the problem is so much involved in your workplace mahi, is there somebody else that can do it? Now, last week, I showed this graphic, which I apologize for. It's imperfect because I drew it and I'm trying to be imperfect. And it's about finding the right fit. So I'm just going to talk through this as I did a little bit last week. Monetary spending on climate change is massive. We know that. Globally, it's becoming huge. But some of us find this frustrating because we can't necessarily see where the action falls out of it. Now, this picture is just kind of an attempt at showing the government, the beehive, and then looking through a narrow lens of climate carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions targets. Now, most language related to climate these days is to do with emissions, and rightfully so, because we have urgency around lowering them. However, this is part of a system, and it's the system, remember, the system that we live within, that has caused all of the issues that we're currently living in. So the questions in bold here are, can you find an area of neglect? So when we look to some of these things, we ask ourselves, both in the sector that we work in, but also the personal fit that's right for you, what areas are of particular interest or particularly true in your region, or particularly fit with your values and your skill sets? So there's many things that cause environmental degradation, for example, overconsumption. There are many things in our education system that are missing in terms of climate knowledge. There are many things in our past, such as historical harm or Indigenous rights, that haven't yet been acknowledged. So there are many foundations, such as the Te Tiriti o Waitangi, that we can lean to that can help us to find areas of neglect that we can then focus on for climate impact. It's not just this narrow vision, albeit very important. Does that make sense? I'm relying on you here, Michelle, to give me a nod. And last week I spoke to a tika transition, and this word tika comes from tikanga, and it essentially means just or equitable. So I'm talking very widely here, and I may have lost you a little bit, but it's really about recognizing that sometimes we put pressures on ourselves to not know everything about carbon emissions or to lower our emissions of our organization. But if we don't have the skill set, it might not be asking the right question. It might not be the right approach. So I'm going to just use a community example as a quick case study to explain some of this. And it's one that's close to my heart because it's one that I led. And so I'm going to talk about it because I've got the experience that I'm referring to today in terms of this inside-out approach. So here's a picture on the screen. What I want you to do in the chat is to just write down what's the problem we're trying to solve here. So look at the picture. What's the problem we're trying to solve, do you think, given that there's a picture in front of us? Is there anything coming through, Michelle?
Yeah, we've got pollution, environment/conservation. Yeah, product design, pollution again, plastic waste, plastic usage, and laziness of putting things actually in the bin. Linear systems, education around environment, yeah, reducing single-use plastics, overpopulation or overuse of plastics, policy change relating to environmental regulations.
Okay, so really what I'm saying there is there are so many problems within that. So this is an example that I've chosen to use because it's visual and it's tangible. We can all kind of understand a little bit about plastic pollution and plastic usage. But what the insights are here is that if we want to find a solution, we have to really identify the problem. And we just had at least 8 different problems written up there. So this was a problem that I decided that I wanted to try to solve in my local community. And it stemmed from really just an individual response. Okay, what can I do as an individual? So I'm going to relate it to a community response rather than a workplace one. For me, it was, okay, I can reduce my own plastic. I can make choices around what I buy. I can and never use single use, et cetera, et cetera. I won't labor that point too much. But then I thought, okay, well, what can I do that would be more than that could potentially be an area of neglect? And what's the problem I'm trying to solve? So for me, I decided that if I was to look at event waste, I could start to scale the problem. So Queenstown Tahuna has, we have quite a lot of events here. It's a district, a resort, some people call it, where people want to come and visit, and therefore we have a number of events. And I thought, hang on, if I could take the problem of single use and eliminate that problem, then I could maybe start to scale the impact rather than me just being the end user. So I'm just going to skip to this 1 second and then skip back. When you answered what's the problem, there was a lot of things within this life cycle. And I was highly ambitious in what I was trying to solve because I was looking at, okay, well, I want to stop this life cycle from raw material being used in the first place to its use and then its landfill. I want to stop that at its heart and do something different. Okay. But I could have looked at it from the approach of recovery from landfill. So I could have looked at it at the approach of waste minimization at the event. Okay. So in terms of this particular problem, over here we've got something called Disrupt. So the thing that I designed was called Disrupt, and it was about disrupting our dependency on disposables, on single use. And so what we did is I got lots of stainless steel dishes, and I bought those, and we then started to use them at events. But the scale of the problem here was, how could it be scaled from me to we and our community? It suddenly involved lots of stakeholders. So suddenly we had to involve all the caterers. We had to involve all of the hospitality companies that had stalls there. We had to involve people that wanted to wash up. I had to then lobby our local council to look at, okay, well, what is our council waste minimisation policy? What's the contract they hold with events, etc.? So look, this is nothing new. This kind of thing happens everywhere, as we know, or similar things. But the point I'm trying to make is the identification of the problem and how we can scale it. Okay. If you can find a problem within your organization that you can scale or that is going to be able to be solvable at scale, and you can increase the resources you dedicate to it, then you can begin to understand what fraction of the problem that you can solve. So for Disrupt, for example, in its first year, it disrupted 50,000 single-use products. It's gone on to do that year in, year out, and it's incredible. And if we were to be able to scale that in every community, we could make a substantial difference. But one of the things that it's solving, which could have been written in your chat, was behavior change. Okay. So was it a neglected problem? Yes, it was, because what was happening is that environmentally conscious caterers were already using compostable packaging. So they were solving the problem in their way. But compostable packaging, as we know, doesn't actually end up being composted 98% of the time. So if you could just press your mute, please. Thank you. So essentially here, we are starting to look at the system that we're working within and enabling ourselves to be able to look at those three questions around scale, solvability, and neglectedness allows us to be able to design something which is achievable in our own organisation. So what I want to do now is take us into a kind of corporate world. So in terms of moving to our corporate world, what might this look like? We started the conversation with perfectionism. And I mentioned that in the last 30 years, we've seen a huge increase in perfectionism. And my question would really be, are we starting to see this in the corporate world? And my answer to myself, if I was rhetorical about this, would be to say, is greenwashing a symptom of corporate perfectionism? So let's have a little look at what greenwashing might mean and why it might be a form of perfectionism and why it might exist. So we've talked about defining a problem carefully. So in net zero goals, we often have a delayed approach to a perfect goal, or we tell the wrong part of the story, and I'll go on to explain that. So in the chat, could you just let me know if your organisation has any net zero goals? Just say yes or no, if you wouldn't mind, please, in the chat. You may be too small to have any as yet, but if you're a larger organisation, you may have them. Michelle, is there anything coming through there?
Yeah, actually, one person does. Yeah, a couple do, but yeah, lots of no's as well.
Okay.
Oh, actually, it might be about 50-50.
Okay. So obviously there's nothing wrong with a net zero goal. I just wanted to gauge where we're at in this particular group of people. So net zero goals are great to have, but I want to just break them down a little bit so we can understand them. I believe that some of our net zero goals are actually a symptom of delayed perfection. So firstly, let's look at what net zero actually means, because if we're talking about this, we need to all be on the same page. So net zero refers to not just carbon, but to all greenhouse gas emissions. So nitrogen and methane as well, and others. It's when we have our emissions that we produce from our organisation, and they might be scope 1, 2, or 3. So they could be our emissions that include drivers driving to our workplace. They could be our energy use, etc. And then we have a minus sign here, which is taking away absorption. So nature will absorb carbon, and what we are left with is a net zero accounting system, if you like. So very much like monetary accounting when we talk about net worth, for example. So this is a really simple way to think about a hugely complex issue. And obviously, the emissions that we produce, subtracting the absorption that we can utilize. So this is going to generally look like offsets that we buy or credits that we buy, and they could be overseas or that they could be within New Zealand, will then give us a position of carbon that we're left with. If you were carbon positive, you would have fewer emissions and greater absorption, for example. So this sounds really simple, but obviously the complexity lies in how we are absorbing or soaking up that carbon, and also what we are actually accounting. Are we only accounting for our scope 1 emissions, or are we accounting for all of our emissions through the whole supply chain? So if we think about that plastic bottle, There's a whole lot of carbon intensity around that plastic bottles production in the manufacturing, but then it's movement being shipped to the countries that it's exported to. So we're talking about greenwashing here, and I'm going to explain what that is, but I'm just going to show you that what we're starting to see, both in New Zealand and elsewhere, is that net zero claims are beginning to be challenged. Now, this isn't to fill you with fear, but this is just to explain the process of delayed perfectionism and being careful about our approach to it. So what we see here, I'm just going to, I think, highlight a couple of them, is that our courts and our lawyers and our advertising standards and our consumer organisations, watchdogs, are starting to challenge whether the statements that are being made are actually substantiated. So, for example, First Gas used language saying it was ensuring it was going zero carbon. Or Z Energy said it was getting out of the petrol business, and that was because of its provision in EV charging stations, even though it's the second largest emitter of carbon in New Zealand. We also have slightly different versions where, for example, there was an advertising ban on HSBC Bank because it was advertising the net zero goals of a product of it, but it didn't disclose its huge finance of fossil fuel projects. So it's about how material something is as part of the whole organisation. So if HSBC is spending 90% of its investment in fossil fuels, but only 10% on net zero goals of a particular product, then obviously that is making some misleading claims. So hopefully that explains what we're starting to see. But what's really important here is that we're, for the first time in New Zealand, actually being held to account. And so these case laws that are coming through will actually challenge our biggest emitters to behave differently. Now, a quick question back to you is, do you have a board of trustees? We've got a lot of community groups here. So if you have a board that are your governance board, this is something that they really need to upskill on. So it's worth speaking to your board chair. Anything coming through there, Michelle?
Yeah, lots of yeses. Yeah, looks like almost everybody's got a board.
Okay. So we have different roles to play in our organisations. You might be the CEO, you might be a climate lead or other. You might be a chair, you might be a trustee. What's really important here is that steering the organisation is obviously part of the governance role. So it's a big emerging sector, but what's really important now is that the best course of action is just to be aware. So highlighting a couple of words here, being aware and open to learning about the relevance of climate impact and about the board's climate literacy and climate competencies. And there's a lot of material out there. Now, if any of you if it's kind of piques your interest and you want more, this particular webinar today is very generalized, but we do have very bespoke learning tools for you that you can utilize. So I'm just going to flesh out what we mean by greenwashing and why it's worth understanding the board or the organisational risk associated with it. So risks can be in lots of forms, but at this stage, it's really important to get the messaging right about what you're doing in terms of how you're progressing to that goal that you've got written on your website or in your documentation. So there's three aspects that I want you to consider today, and they are greenwashing, green wishing, and green hushing. So who knew? There's lots of greens. There's about 6 different ways that we can talk about greenwashing. Today, we're just going to look at 3. So greenwashing could be, for example, when we've got a goal of net zero 2050, but the bigger piece of our, how best to say this? For example, our investment portfolio is committed to fossil fuels, like I mentioned with HSBC, but our our operations focus on net zero. So it's a really small component of what we do is actually focused on net zero. That is an example of greenwashing. Greenwishing is similar, but it's a little bit different. So greenwishing is when organizations state its target. So let's say, for example, again, net zero 2050, because it's very common. But it actually has no transparent pathway to how it will achieve its goal. So that's slightly different. That's not saying that the bulk of what we're doing is investing in fossil fuels. That's just saying we haven't made it clear how we're going to get there. It's wishing. Simply put, we can't state something if we don't have a robust and testable pathway to how we're going to get there and how we're going to measure our achievements as we go. So in New Zealand, we're really good at greenwashing, and it's probably going to start to be recognised more and more. The other end of it is green hushing, and this is when a company actually stops talking about anything that they do because they don't want to be criticised for not doing enough. So look, we recognise the challenge. This is like one part of climate action, but the complexity of how it's accepted in society and how we need to talk about it is really, really complex. So it really comes back down to defining the problem carefully again. And in carbon accounting, it's the important things that we need to look at are what we're measuring. So if we know what we're measuring, that's what we talk about in our documentation. The next thing is the goal or the target that we're setting. So if it's a net zero claim, which can entail a lot of perfectionism language, that's very different to just a reduction claim. So reducing our carbon emissions is much easier to actually communicate and signal. And essentially what this is all about is just how we communicate any progress with our stakeholders. It is about recognizing when we're looking at perfectionism, which is when it's like shiny and new and sells an idea versus what is achievable and true. So I'm not going to speak through this, but I'm just going to show you that we have a lot of problematic language. It's happening in a lot of our sectors, and it is happening in philanthropy as well. And it's where we see it is in things like annual reports or disclosure statements or prospectus. So, and also websites. So just worth thinking about. The way to get it right is simply to think about what we document is what we do. So if your website looks a little bit different to your reality, then we're a long way off. So once we align these views, this is where you get the closest to perfect. The documentation represents the reality. And essentially what this looks like is something called a transition plan. And today I'm just mentioning that language. Many of you will know about it if you're in bigger organizations, but essentially it's about saying, what do we mean by a transition plan? It's about mapping our interim targets. It's about being able to describe how we do things. So this particular language here is a defined term from something called climate statements. But a better way to think about it is mapping and communicating our continuous improvement rather than focusing on that delayed perfection. And what this looks like in terms of how it fits is that we know that you will have, many of you will have governance, you'll have your strategy, you'll have your risk management, and you have your metrics and targets. And transitioning to a lower emission society has to be shown and take place throughout all of these for it to be a transition plan. It's how the entity will position itself in the transition. Hopefully that makes sense. Wow, I've just talked a heck of a lot. Do any of you have a transition plan? I'm interested to know.
Oh, yes, somebody does. Let's have one.
Yeah, okay.
Couple of no's, couple of no's.
Okay. Again, it's going to be varied. So for those of you that, you know, have that level of climate literacy, that there's other products out there that we can provide for you. But for those of you who don't, it's more about the overarching, I guess, messaging from this webinar that's going to be useful. So I'm going to start to close off now. And essentially, it comes back to the simplicity. So it's about starting. Some of you on this webinar may not have started. It's about taking steps. It's about sharing wins, and it's about adapting and starting again. So I cannot say it enough about identifying the problem you're trying to solve. Do not copy and paste from others. Find what works for your organization. Involve everyone. I work across a number of different community groups and community trusts. And what I see still, and what I'd like to see change, is that we are still leaning on one champion in our organization or one specialist. We have to move beyond that. Change can't happen with only one champion. Start small, set realistic goals, and set achievable targets. And importantly, everyone has to understand it, because if you can't understand the technical language and your organizational colleagues cannot understand it, I don't think that it's a really worthwhile approach. Celebrate the wins to stay motivated and inspired. Embrace the missteps and then adapt and adjust as you go. So I mentioned a kind of community case study before, and this is just a kind of organizational one. Really simple, but really effective. So Great South, based down in the deep south in Invercargill. They actually have a monthly carbon tracker. And as you can see here, it's just an approach that is achievable targets. Everyone understands. It's looking at their whole workplace. You could do this within scope 1, 2, or 3. This is including scope 2 and 3 emissions in their particular organization. But they look at flights, electricity, the staff commute, the vehicle fleet, waste, and water. And every month they change this up so that they can start to address it. It's a really good visual way to involve people. They celebrate wins, as many of you probably do in your organization. And this particular one is around the commute to work and changing it out to a bike and just getting everybody involved from the office. So again, really simple, but without doing these things, we don't really take our community and our colleagues on board. The really cool thing that they also do is they make it really tactile. And here on this total annual carbon emissions, they actually put lumps of coal. I don't know if they're real lumps of coal, but they put coal in here and track the carbon emissions throughout the whole year with a target, which is reduced from the year before. And that's just a really visual way, I think, for people to get on board. So at the end of the day, small steps are still steps. And I personally find when I'm working with organizations that those that have the kind of shiny documentation can't always tell me the small steps that they're taking. So this is where I would start. And when you start to walk the way does appear. I don't generally quote Rumi, but I do think it's really relevant to this. When we look at building our own resilience, it comes in so many different forms. So I just wanted to kind of close with the idea that climate action shouldn't be confined to a box. It isn't just your net zero goals. It is everything else. We have heaps of resources on the Climate Action Aotearoa page. This link will be shared with you. But it could look like any of these things. It could look like gathering relevant data. It could look like your investment portfolio. It could look like emergency planning. It could look like eco-psychology courses. I mean, honestly, it's wide. Find what's neglected and find what fits. So closing comments. Please identify if there is perfectionism in your team or in your organization that might be slowing down climate action. Please identify the problem. Think about how it aligns with the teak transition to that the wee drawing that I had with the beehive in the background. What aspects can you look to? And has your organisation got a transition plan? Do the documents reflect the reality? If they do, you are fully on the right track. So there are a whole host of websites that I would recommend. Some of these ones at the bottom here are from last week as well. And others are Climate Action Aotearoa website. This is based around the funders' commitment on climate action. And it has a heap of free resources that you can utilise. Then we've got some resources on greenwashing and greenwishing that can be really helpful, and a couple of articles as well that could be helpful to you. So I'm going to close after such a lengthy session and hope that you've found it useful. I think we have a couple of moments for questions, Michelle. So,
if anyone would like to pop a question in the chat, we could see if we've got time. I had a quick ask as well.
Sure.
Yeah, just as part of our Te Pūaha talks, we really want to make them as helpful as possible and relevant to your organisation. So I'm here just to wheel out my little survey again and say, please share back to us. We'd love to hear what's really, really useful information for you. So I'll flick it through later in an email as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. It's really important to hear back.
Yeah, no questions popping through yet. So yeah, maybe we'll just say our emails are open. You're very welcome to send them through later.
Thank you so much. So I appreciate everyone attending today, and I hope that you can take something from it. And as I say, go back to those resources because I'm sure you'll find something in there that will be really useful to you. The other thing is you can come back to me if you've got any specific questions. So thank you all again. It's great to have been a part of it, and I hope that you can stay in touch. Kia ora.
Ka kite.
Ka kite.